In this video, we're going to talk about the basic function of HTML and CSS, both separately what they do and then how they work together. So here's an example with HTML. Now remember, we know how this looks. We remember the whole thing about the content on the page and then the tags that give instructions to the browser about how to render. And we see here we've got heading 1, and here it is on the page, and then we've got a paragraph of text, and here that is on the page. So they look different, and these are just the default codes for a heading 1 and a paragraph. So this code renders this content in the browser. Now here's some CSS, and remember, we see the distinctive elements here too. We've got our curly brackets, we've got some colons, we've got some semicolons, and then we've got some values in here. Okay, now just if we read through these properties, we actually can make quite a lot of sense out of this. So on the body in general, right, we're setting a few attributes that are going to apply to the entire body of our web page. One of them is the font family is going to be Verdana, and you probably know that font. And if Verdana is for some reason not available in that browser, it's just going to default to the sans serif font, and that is just font without the little feet. Okay. The background color of the page, right, is given a color value here, and we'll talk about what goes on with these color values a little bit later, but just trust me that that is the value of a specific color. Then here for H1, we're changing the font size from the default, and we're changing the color from the default. And then for the paragraph tag, we're changing the color for the default. So we have some idea of what this is going to do. Now, notice this is just sort of floating out on its own. So we need to think about how we get this, together with our HTML. But let's talk for just a second about CSS function. So if we notice, the HTML itself is directly interacting with the content on the page and telling us how that's going to be rendered through, the tags give the structure, a heading versus a paragraph, right? That tells you how the content functions in relationship to each other. The CSS tells us how it looks, the details of the font family, the background color. So all these things that the CSS does are actually sort of apart from the meaning of the page, right? The look of your text is really more of an aesthetic element, a design element. So we don't need to have that integrated in the same way as we do with our HTML that's telling us about how the content is related to each other, right? The CSS is sort of a thing apart. It adds a lot of aesthetic value to the page, and it can even add a lot of usability and functionality for the user. And we'll see how that goes as we continue to learn the coding. But what we want to really do is keep all of these, all of this information about how the content looks away from and apart from the basic information about how the content is structured. We can look at that side by side. So here we've got your heading 1 just as a structural element, and here we have your heading 1, how it's going to look. Here we have your paragraph structural element. Here's the paragraph, how it's going to look. And just remember, when we're talking about how it's going to look, it's going to include the specific code for P and for H1, but it will also include some of the look from here, right? Everything on the page will have this background color. So you could consider your H1 will also have this background color, your P will also have this background color, and everything on the page is going to be in this font. So that's going to include your H1 and your P. So think again about how, because this is the bigger container, these tags are going to inherit the properties from that bigger container, okay? Unless we tell it not to, and we haven't in this case, okay? So also, I want you to, in the side-by-side comparison, just notice too the different look between them. And again, be able to visually identify. When you're seeing your angle brackets, HTML. When you're seeing your curly brackets and your colons and your semicolons, CSS. Now let's take a look at how we could get these two to work together. So now here's a single HTML page, but notice it has both HTML and CSS code in it. Just take a moment and look at that and make sure that you can identify which is the HTML and which is the CSS. Okay, now notice there's one new tag in here called style, and it's an HTML code, but what it does is let the browser know, hey, for a little bit, I'm going to be switching to CSS. So this style tag, and we'll talk about how to appropriately put style tags and whatever, but just I'll say for the moment, it goes in the head of the document, not down in the body where all the content is. So notice you've got this style tag in here. It allows us to switch into CSS mode for a little bit, and then this CSS will apply to this HTML. Okay, so now we have a really good sense of how this is going to look because we've talked it all through. You should have a pretty decent expectation of what this is going to do once we see it rendered. So let's take a look. Was it what you expected? Now, you probably didn't know exactly what colors these are going to be, but hopefully you had imagined something like this. We're going to have a heading that's pretty large that is in a sans serif Verdana font. We have a page with a background color, and we have some different colors assigned to the H1 and the paragraph. So this gives you a sense of how HTML and CSS are different, but also how we can use them together to create content on a page.